It was one of those mornings when Oxford looked as though it had been painted, then left out in the rain. A thin mist clung to the edges of Broad Street, softening the outlines of bicycles, stone, and the few figures moving through the quiet. The first bell of Magdalen came floating across the air, not urgent, not even clear, merely an old sound in an older city. I remember thinking how comforting it was to hear something that had no ambition but to exist. I was sitting in a cafe I had no real reason to be in, except that the windows were clean and the waitress didn't seem inclined to talk. The crossword lay before me, half-heartedly filled. 7 down had been troubling me. Regret expressed through absence. 5. I'd written the word remise and crossed it out twice. There are times when the answer resists, not because one doesn't know it, but because it prefers to wait until it hurts a little more. The paper was folded awkwardly against my coffee cup, a habit of mine. I noticed the small article by accident, a few lines under the court reports, just above the advertisements for piano lessons and flatlets. Body found near Port Meadow. Police appeal for information. There was nothing especially dramatic in the report. A woman, middle-aged, no identification save for a single library card. The Bodleian, Hilary term, 1974. Cause of death unknown, and yet I felt, absurdly, that I had been mentioned. Lewis would later call it coincidence, that old, dependable word used by men who prefer to keep order in the world. But there was a tug somewhere behind the ribs. 1974, the term when I was still learning that truth, like beauty, depended on the angle of light. I had been young enough then to think memory could be selective. It isn't. I paid the bill with unnecessary precision, the coins clinking too loudly in the saucer. The waitress said something about the weather. A gentle sort of drizzle, she called it, and I nodded, though I was already gone in my head. Out on the pavement, the air smelt faintly of wet paper and diesel. The buses hissed along High Street like indifferent animals. I turned toward St. Giles and began walking without purpose, which is to say, toward the inevitable. The police cordon was still up by the time I reached the meadow. A constable, young and eager to be helpful, raised the tape for me. Lewis was there, his coat darker than usual, his expression a mix of sympathy and suppressed irritation. He said she'd been found early, before sunrise, by a jogger. No signs of struggle, no handbag, no footprints worth mentioning. The doctor reckoned she'd been in the water for some hours, the current kind enough to return her. There was something theatrical about the scene. The wide openness of the meadow, the mild indecency of onlookers pretending to be passers-by. I remember crouching near the body, the plastic sheeting lifting slightly in the wind. Her hair was pale, her face calm, the lines around her, eyes suggesting laughter, had once been permitted. Someone had taken care to arrange her hands, as if she'd been left in apology rather than cruelty. Lewis mentioned a scrap of paper found nearby, folded, rain-blotted. He handed it to me inside an evidence sleeve. It was a fragment of verse, typewritten. "Woman much missed how you fail to me. Fail to me." I frowned. Hardy never wrote that. It was call, not fail. I knew it as one knows one's own reflection. That single substituted word altered everything. Affection turned into reproach. I said nothing aloud. Lewis waited, then sighed in that long-suffering way of his. Back at the path, a bicycle bell rang behind me. Sharp, immediate, jarring against the stillness. I stepped aside instinctively. A student, late for something, pedaled past, her scarf trailing. The sound lingered longer than it should have. Bells do that here. They insist on being remembered. I glanced once more toward the body as they lifted it into the van. The mist had begun to lift. The grass, slick and green, reflected the thin light like a mirror, too honest for comfort. And for reasons I would not admit then, I thought again of Hilary term 1974, of a voice that had once told me memory was a form of punishment. The crossword waited unfinished in my pocket. The clue still unsolved. Regret expressed through absence. 5. Perhaps, I thought, the answer had been there all along. The meadow that morning was quieter than I expected. Even the river seemed uncertain of itself, drifting without conviction between reeds that bent as if ashamed to stand upright. Lewis was already there, his coat collar raised, his breath rising in small, reluctant clouds. The constables moved about with the air of men performing a duty too solemn for curiosity and too ordinary for reverence. Death, when you see enough of it, becomes like weather, something to be endured, not feared. She lay by the water's edge, half turned toward the sky, one arm slightly raised as if waving to someone who had already gone. The mud had darkened her shoes, but the rest of her was strangely untouched. Pale hair, neatly tied. No rings, no earrings, no sign of haste or struggle. The doctor spoke of drowning, perhaps fainting first, perhaps a blow before that. Too many maybes. I remember nodding, though my eyes were elsewhere, on a single piece of paper caught against a clump of grass, fluttering faintly in the wind. It was Lewis who fetched it. The words were blurred but still legible. A fragment of verse, typewritten on old ivory paper. Hardy, unmistakably. Woman much missed, how you fail to me, fail to me. Only it wasn't. That word, fail, echoed oddly, like a mistake no poet could make. The detail clung to me immediately, as all true mistakes do. I slipped it back into its envelope before Lewis could notice the change of expression. She had a name now, though it offered no comfort. Clara Dean. A visiting researcher at St. Hilda's here for Sir. The Hilary term lectures on erased women of Oxford's history, a phrase that seemed both academic and prophetic. According to her temporary rooms, she'd been due to check out the day before, but never returned. The porter said she had received a visitor late at night, a man with a red umbrella, though there had been no rain. He hadn't caught the face, but remembered the gesture, the way the man tapped the umbrella twice against the step before leaving. I found that small detail more unsettling than the death itself. Lewis wanted to question the college staff immediately, but I told him to wait. There is a time for interrogation and a time for silence. The silence, in this case, had begun to whisper. I walked along the bank, shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. A gull rose from the water and circled once, uncertain, before vanishing into mist. There are moments when Oxford seems less a place than a recurring dream. The same faces, the same sins, rehearsed endlessly, with different names. At St. Hilda's, the portress recognized the description at once. Yes, Miss Dean had been quiet, polite, rather serious. She spent hours in the library, working through college minutes and personal correspondence from the early 70s. Something about a thesis, or was it a book? She couldn't say. I thanked her and stepped into the library. The smell was of dust, dry ink, and forgotten ambition. On the table near the window, the librarian had left a few of Clara's belongings for collection, a fountain pen, a half-empty packet of Gauloises, and a notebook wrapped in brown paper. I remember the sound of the floorboards beneath me, each creak precise, deliberate, like a warning. I sat down and opened the notebook. Inside, only lists, names, dates, small annotations in neat handwriting. One name had been underlined twice, E. March. It meant nothing to Lewis when I mentioned it later, though it meant something to me, enough to close the book quietly and say we'd return tomorrow. Before leaving, I paused near the chapel, where a faint organ note was drifting out from morning practice. It was the same tune I'd heard once, years ago, when waiting for someone who never came. Memory, when it intrudes, has the peculiar tactlessness of a drunk at a funeral. Lewis asked if I was all right. I said I was thinking about Hardy, about the difference a single word could make. Call to me, fail to me. love mistaken for reproach. He nodded, perhaps assuming it was philosophy, when in truth it was only observation. That night, alone in my flat, I laid the paper beside the lamp and studied it again. The typing was faintly uneven, as though from an old machine, one letter slightly misaligned. I found myself staring not at the words but at the gaps between them, the spaces where breath might have been. When I folded it back into its sleeve, I noticed the edge of another paper beneath. A library receipt, stamped in faded ink. Bodleian Library. Hilary, term, 1974. I sat there a long while, the whiskey in my hand untouched. Outside, the rain began, hesitant at first, then steady, the sort of rain that falls as if keeping a secret. It was one of those afternoons when the light seemed to hesitate before entering the windows. Thin, undecided, as though Oxford herself wished to withhold a little of her beauty until she was sure who was asking. St. Hilda's lay across the river like a memory, respectable, discreet, and just faintly regretful. I've always thought that certain colleges carry within their stones an air of apology, as if built not to celebrate knowledge, but to mourn it. Lewis and I were met at the porter's lodge by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Margaret Linton. The title, she said with the modesty of pride, had only recently been conferred. She had been close to Clara Dean, or as close as academics ever are, which is to say, they shared the same silence for different reasons. Her voice was calm, though her fingers betrayed her. The steady adjustment of a cuff, the unnecessary turning of a ring. She said Clara's death was a tragedy for the college, though her tone suggested inconvenience more than sorrow. I noticed a faint smear of ink on her left thumb. Those who work too long in libraries often carry their ghosts in pigment. She led us through a corridor where the floorboards creaked in the way that only old wood can, not in protest, but in recollection. The walls bore portraits of women who had taught Latin before it was fashionable to let them. All looked faintly astonished to have been remembered. The air smelt of dust, warm stone, and the particular melancholy of places where too much thought has been thought. Dr. Linton explained that Clara had been researching the college's archives. Early female scholars, forgotten correspondences, small injustices preserved on paper. She had mentioned a discovery, something significant, but hadn't elaborated. Linton smiled in that careful way that makes you distrust the smile more than the words. The last time she had seen Clara was the evening before the death. Clara had seemed agitated, distracted. There had been, she said, a visitor, a man, older, carrying a red umbrella. She added the detail without emphasis, as though she regretted giving it. Lewis noted it down dutifully, while I pretended not to notice how Linton's eyes followed the pen. When she left us in the reading room, the silence felt arranged. A long table stretched before us, the surface polished to a dull gleam, stacks of papers waiting like obedient servants. The library assistant, a pale, apologetic man, told me Clara's workroom was at the far end, second desk on the right. There, under a shaded lamp, were her belongings. Notebooks, a university guide from the 70s, and a letter pressed flat under glass. I bent closer. The letter was unsigned, but written in an elegant, slanted hand. It spoke of memory, betrayal, and the impossibility of truth in institutions built on illusion. A line near the end caught my eye. We must keep faith with our ghosts, or they will speak without us. I read it twice, perhaps 3 times. It wasn't what it said, but how it said it, the rhythm, the faint self-consciousness. A woman's voice, educated, wounded, proud. Lewis called me over to a cabinet where he'd found a file labeled 1974 Disciplinary Proceedings. He asked whether it might mean anything. The year again, Hilary term. The same as the library card, the same as the article that had started all this. It is one of life's small mercies that police work occasionally rewards superstition. I told him to sign it out for review, though I already knew we would find less than we hoped and more than we wanted. Before leaving, I stood by the window. The view looked out onto the cloisters, where a lone student crossed, head down, carrying books against the wind. A red umbrella leaned against the wall, unopened, absurdly bright against the greying stone. No rain had fallen that day. I remember the faintest prickle of deduction forming, the sort that begins without one's consent, an umbrella used in dry weather, a visitor arriving unrecorded, a phrase misquoted in Hardy, the beginnings of a pattern so quiet it almost apologized for existing. Dr. Linton reappeared at the door, her voice soft, asking if we'd finished. I said yes, though it wasn't true. As we walked out, she mentioned that Clara had once confided a strange fear that the dead were better remembered at Oxford than the living. I thought about that as we stepped into the cold air. Lewis remarked that it was a bleak thing to say. I told him it was merely accurate. That night, as I wrote my notes, I found myself drawing a small red circle around the word ghosts. It wasn't a clue, not yet, just a whisper of one. Oxford, after all, is full of them. There are objects that seem innocent until one begins to think about their presence. The red umbrella was such a thing. Too bright, too deliberate, an intrusion upon the grey decorum of Oxford. Lewis said it was a coincidence that umbrellas, like secrets, turn up everywhere when the weather demands them. But there had been no rain that night, and I've never believed in coincidences that wear such loud colours. Dr. Philip Graves met us in his rooms at Corpus. A heavy man, urbane and faintly theatrical. He carried the kind of arrogance that comes not from intelligence, but from the habit of being listened to. He poured wine before offering it, a gesture that said as much about him as any confession could. He spoke of Clara Dean in the measured tone of a man accustomed to both admiration and disdain. She had, he said, been a brilliant woman, if somewhat unstable, prone to obsessions. He paused just long enough to let the word acquire its weight. Obsessions, after all, are more dangerous in women. The umbrella stood behind, him leaning against the radiator. Its handle was carved ivory, old, perhaps even valuable. I asked casually whether he'd been at St. Hilda's the evening before Clara's death. He smiled, and the lines around his mouth rearranged themselves into charm. A brief visit, he said. Academic consultation. The rain had been threatening, so he'd taken the precaution of carrying an umbrella. When I pointed out that the Met Office had predicted a dry spell, he chuckled softly. One doesn't trust forecasts, Inspector, least of all in England. He spoke well. Too well. The sort of eloquence that dulls rather than sharpens meaning. I watched him as he talked, noting the way his fingers tapped against his glass, not in impatience but calculation. Each pause seemed rehearsed, each recollection selected. I'd encountered men like him before, those who believe intellect is immunity. Lewis, bless him, grew restless and began examining the framed degrees on the wall. I remained seated. There was a moment, brief but telling, when I asked about Hardy. Clara's fragment, I said, had contained a curious misquotation. Graves blinked, too quickly, as if to brush away recognition. Hardy, he murmured, wasn't among his favourites. Too sentimental, too provincial. The lie was small, but it hung in the air like smoke. A man who dismissed Hardy did not quote him in footnotes. I'd read one of Graves's essays years ago in which he'd done precisely that. As we left, I glanced once more at the umbrella. Its tip was faintly scuffed, as though it had been driven into wet soil. It wasn't much. The kind of mark one forgets unless one wishes not to. Lewis held the door, muttering that Graves was insufferable. I said nothing. The sound of the rainless wind outside was oddly comforting. That evening I walked through Christchurch Meadow, where the air smelt faintly of iron and fallen leaves. I thought of Clara, of the photograph I'd seen in her notebook, of the names she'd underlined. A pattern was beginning to form, faint like ink bleeding through paper. The red umbrella, the altered line in Hardy, the year 1974, repeating itself like a refrain. I wondered whether any of it mattered, and whether I cared for the truth or simply for the shape of it. At home, I poured whiskey into a glass already half warmed by my hand. The crossword lay open on the table. 11 across, falsehood's companion, 4. I filled in love before crossing it out. Too obvious. Then lust, too easy. Finally, without thinking, I wrote rain. It made no sense, but felt right, the kind of answer one doesn't understand until it's too late. Lewis called later to say Graves had alibied himself neatly. Dinner with colleagues, lecture notes time-stamped. Everything clean, everything accounted for. I told him to check the staff car park instead. Umbrellas don't always stay where one leaves them. He laughed, asked if I'd been drinking, and said he'd look into it tomorrow. After the call, I found myself standing by the window, listening to nothing in particular. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows, and somewhere in the distance a bell tolled for evensong. I thought again of Graves's fingers, the faint tremor when Hardy's name was spoken, and of Clara's last words on the page. How you fail to me. It was not just a misprint, I was certain now. It was an accusation. There are evenings in Oxford that begin without purpose and end with memory. And that one began, I think, at the King's Arms. It had rained earlier, leaving the cobbles slick, the reflections of lamplight trembling in puddles like indecisive thoughts. I had not planned to drink, which of course meant I would. Lewis had gone home, leaving me with my notes, the Hardy misquote, and the faint taste of futility that all unsolved things leave behind. The pub was half empty, as it often is before the students return. A few scholars in worn tweed murmured about funding, about the death of Latin, about the death of everything. The air was thick with that affectionate kind of despair Oxford does so well. Resignation disguised as wit. I sat at a cornered table beneath a framed print of the Radcliffe camera, ordered a pint, and pretended to work. In truth, I was thinking about Clara Dean, about her folded paper by the river, about the line she had changed. Fail to me. I'd begun to suspect the alteration was deliberate, a message rather than an error. But meant for whom? The sound of laughter carried from the bar. Brittle, masculine, half cruel. 2 lecturers from Balliol, I later learned, discussing the death as one might discuss weather. One of them, a tall man with thinning hair and a mouth too practiced for sincerity, said Morse won't find a morale in this one. His companion replied that there was no moral to be found in women who read too much. I watched their reflections in the mirror behind the bar, the way one might watch birds from a window. Detached curiosity tinged with contempt. It was only later, when they left, that I noticed what they had left behind. A scrap of newspaper folded inside a menu. Not deliberate, perhaps, not concealed, merely forgotten. The crossword half finished. I turned it over. The clue at 8 across read, unoriginal sin, 8. The answer was already filled in. Plagiary. I stared at it longer than I should have. When I asked the barman if he knew their names, he nodded. One was Dr. Halloran, Balliol English faculty, and the other, a fellow in moral philosophy whose name escaped him. Plagiarism, 1974. Balliol. The words fell together like dust in sunlight. I remembered Clara's notes, the reference to a sealed disciplinary file from that same year. I had dismissed it as academic gossip. But gossip, I've found, is often the body's way of confessing what the mind denies. The evening lengthened. I ordered another pint, though I didn't drink it. The noise in the pub had grown gentle, the eyes sort of murmur that might pass for comfort if one is lonely enough. I found myself thinking about Evelyn March again. The name underlined twice in Clara's book. The photograph with the inscription about sin and memory. I had known her once, briefly, when she still smiled at questions before answering them. Some mistakes, it seems, survive longer than their makers. When I left the pub, the air had turned cold. I walked through Broad Street, the stones glistening beneath the lamps. A group of students passed by, singing badly, untroubled by anything beyond the next hour. One of them stumbled and laughed, his voice echoing off the walls of Blackwell's. For a moment I envied him his ignorance, the pure, temporary kind. At home, I placed the crossword beside my case notes. The word plagiary looked out of place among the official paperwork, too literary for a police file. I poured a measure of whiskey and stood by the window. Across the street, a cat moved along a wall, its shadow larger than its body. I thought of Clara again, her pursuit of truth through archives and silence, her misplaced faith that Oxford remembers the right things. Lewis would later call it coincidence, my finding that crossword. But coincidences, like wine, have a way of revealing what we already know. The past was returning, not in grand gestures, but in small, stubborn echoes. I raised my glass, though not in celebration. A toast, perhaps, to the ones who once believed knowledge could save them, to forgotten names and the quiet ruin they left behind. The next morning began as many do in Oxford, with fog rising from the river like something reluctant to part from the past. I was awake before dawn, sitting at my desk, the crossword half finished beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold too soon. 7 Down still stared back at me, memory preserved in fragments. 6. I had written shards and left it there, unsatisfied. By the time Lewis arrived, I had already decided where we were going. He didn't ask why. He had learned that my silences, though irritating, often led somewhere unpleasantly precise. St. Hilda's again, the archive room, the smell of old paper, the cautious light filtered through curtains not opened in years. We were met by the college librarian, a nervous woman whose cardigan seemed older than most of the manuscripts around her. She asked what we hoped to find. I told her I didn't know, which was, for once, true. The file Lewis had retrieved the day before, 1974, disciplinary proceedings, waited on the table, bound in twine so brittle it broke at the first tug. Inside, pages typed in fading ink, minutes of a closed hearing, names redacted with heavy black lines. But there was one loose sheet, wedged near the back. A letter, unsigned, dated March 1974. It spoke of academic misconduct, a borrowed thesis, reputations at risk. The language was too elegant for accusation. It was the phrasing of someone confessing on behalf of another. Lewis shifted behind me, uncomfortable with the stillness. He pointed out a reference in the margin. See photographic evidence, Appendix D. The appendix, however, was missing. The librarian swore softly under her breath, the kind of oath born not from anger, but embarrassment. She thought perhaps the photographs had been removed years ago when the archives were reorganized. She remembered an assistant taking them for preservation. I asked her who the assistant had been. She hesitated, then said the name as though tasting it. Margaret Linton. It was a small deduction, but one that landed like a pebble in a pond, the ripples invisible at first. Linton again. The woman who had shown us the library, who had spoken of Clara with controlled sympathy. A woman, I thought, who disliked the disorder of truth. Before leaving, I wandered to a shelf at the far end. Dust lay on the spines like ash. There, between volumes of college correspondence 1972 to 1975, I found a narrow envelope, unlabeled. Inside, 3 black and white photographs. The first, 6 young scholars standing before a sundial in the college garden. The second, a close-up of the same group, though one face had been cut out neatly, as if the past itself had performed the surgery. The third, the missing face, or rather the shadow of it. The corner of a dress, a hand holding a cigarette, a glimpse of laughter. I recognized Clara Dean immediately, though she could not have been more than 20 then. And beside her, in the space where the scissors had spared a sliver, another figure half in light, Evelyn March. I said her name aloud, perhaps too softly for Lewis to hear. It wasn't surprise I felt, but that quieter sensation that comes when memory turns conspirator. I had known Evelyn once, too well and not well enough. A mind like a blade, a smile like surrender disguised as victory. Lewis asked what I'd found. I handed him the photograph without comment. He looked from the faces to me, waiting for an explanation that didn't arrive. I asked him to check whether Dr. Linton had signed the archives out recently and whether Evelyn March still lived in Oxford. He scribbled the names in his notebook with that mix of obedience and suspicion he reserved for my less conventional instructions. When he left, I remained a while longer. The photographs lay before me in the pale light. In the background of the first image, carved faintly into the stone of the sundial, were the words, "Only time keeps faith." It was nearly illegible, but I saw it. Clara must have seen it too. Perhaps that was why she came here, to uncover a faith the living had lost. Back in my flat, I pinned the photograph to the wall above my desk. The faces stared back, calm and self-assured, unaware that half a century later, a tired detective would be reading their expressions for guilt. The crossword still waited, its clue unresolved. Memory preserved in fragments. 6. I looked at the photo, at the missing face, at the pieces that refused to fit. Then, slowly, I wrote the word relics. It wasn't quite right, but it would do. There is a particular stillness in Oxford when something terrible has just happened. It is not silence exactly, but the faint rearrangement of sound. Footsteps that hesitate, doors that close more softly, clocks that seem reluctant to strike the hour. That morning began like that. Lewis's voice on the telephone had been calm, too calm, which meant I was needed. He said they'd found Dr. Philip Graves in his study at Corpus, sitting quite properly at his desk, as if waiting for the next tutorial. The air in the room was heavy with something metallic, though the window had been left open. Graves' hand lay upon the crossword page of the Times, his fingers just touching the word Hilary. He'd written the clue number beside it. 14 down, a term for faith or deception, 6. The answer space was blank. Beside the puzzle sat an untouched glass of sherry and a single cufflink shaped like a book. The other cuff was bare. Lewis muttered about heart attacks, natural causes. He always began there, like a man refusing to step into cold water. But even as the doctor made his polite pronouncements, I could see the details gathering weight. A man who poured himself a drink and never touched it. A crossword left half-solved by a scholar who prided himself on precision. The umbrella leaning against the chair, the same ivory handle I remembered too well. Still damp at the tip, though the night had been dry. I walked around the desk, touching nothing. There was a faint smear on the glass, as though someone had lifted it, hesitated, then replaced it exactly. The sherry bottle bore 2 fingerprints, neither likely to be Graves's. His hands, even in death, were too carefully clean. On the blotter, a folded note, no words, only an indentation where a pen had pressed through a sheet above it. Lewis fetched a pencil, shading lightly across the surface until faint letters emerged. She knows. He asked who she might be. I didn't answer. I thought of Dr. Linton, of Clara's neat handwriting in the archives, of the missing appendix. Graves had been involved with both, the living and the dead. Perhaps Oxford's ghosts had grown impatient for justice. Outside, the morning light had a peculiar pallor, the kind that turns the stones of Corpus almost blue. A bell began to toll somewhere. St. Aldate's, I think, though at the time I could not have said why it struck me as mournful. I told Lewis to have the umbrella checked for prints, to confirm the bottle's sequence of use, and to find out who last visited graves after midnight. He nodded, already weary. When he left to make his calls, I remained in the study. The bookshelves were lined with volumes of theology and moral philosophy, irony stacked neatly by the yard. On one shelf, wedged between the Confessions of St. Augustine and a first edition of Hardy's Poems of 1912-13, a gap precisely 2 inches wide where a book was missing. I knew instinctively which book it was. Moments of Vision, the same title Clara had borrowed, the same volume whose library card bore the 2 dates, 1974 and last month. I imagined Graves, turning the pages late at night, reading the misprinted line that had begun this entire case, unaware that its echo would soon be his own. Later, when the body had been taken and the constables dismissed, I stepped outside into the quad. The rain had begun, not hard, but steady, like a hand insisting on being remembered. I stood beneath the archway and watched it beat upon the stone. A porter approached, cap in hand, asking if it was true what he'd heard. I asked what that was. He said Graves had been found smiling. I told him it was only the muscles, nothing more, but I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, in my flat, I spread the photographs across the table. The 6 young scholars before the sundial, the one with Clara and Evelyn half vanished in light. I poured myself a whiskey and stared at their faces. Somewhere in those smiles, a truth was waiting, too patient for its own good. The newspaper report came later that evening. The official cause, heart failure. I closed the paper before finishing the paragraph. On the crossword folded beside me, I filled in the blank. Hilary, a term for faith or deception. 6. The word that came was Lenten, though I wasn't certain why. Perhaps because it implied denial, or perhaps because it felt like penance. I left it there, unconfirmed. Some answers, I've learned, aren't meant to be checked. I remember the walk to Evelyn March's cottage as one of those journeys that begin in logic and end in something closer to confession. The evening had fallen with the kind of quiet that only Oxford manages, a stillness that feels almost designed, as if the city itself has paused to listen. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and the river. Somewhere, a bell tolled the half-hour. It sounded weary, resigned. Her house stood just beyond Jericho, tucked between 2 elder trees, its windows glowing faintly through the fog. Lewis waited by the car, pretending to check his notes, though we both knew why I went in alone. The door opened before I knocked. She stood there, unchanged in the way memory deceives us. The same poise, the same thin composure worn like an apology. Her hair had silvered, but her eyes still carried that mixture of defiance and fatigue that once fascinated me beyond reason. She gestured me inside without a word. The cottage smelled of dust, wine, and unplayed music. On a table near the fire, a record lay out of its sleeve, Schubert's Winterreise. I remember thinking it was too apt to be coincidence. She poured a glass of red for me, one for herself, though neither of us drank. She said she had been expecting me, though I hadn't called ahead. People who live with guilt tend to anticipate their visitors. When she spoke of Clara Dean, her voice trembled only once. Not from grief, but from the precision of memory. Clara had come to her 2 weeks before she died. She had found something, Evelyn said, in the archives. An old disciplinary file, a buried theft. The thesis that had made a reputation in 1974 had not belonged to the man who published it. The work had been hers, Evelyn's. She had written it under the supervision of Graves, who had taken it for his own after she withdrew from the program. It was, as she put it, easier then for a woman to vanish than for a man to be shamed. Clara wanted to set the record right. Evelyn wanted to protect what little peace she had salvaged. Graves had begged her to silence Clara. He feared scandal. She feared remembering. She had agreed to meet the younger woman to ask for time. Not forgiveness, but delay. Clara had refused. Evelyn's voice faltered then, as if the words themselves were treacherous. She said they had argued near the river, that Clara had turned away. She hadn't meant for her to fall, hadn't even seen it happen, only heard the splash and the silence after. I listened, though part of me was elsewhere. Back to the meadow, the body, the misquoted Hardy line, "How you fail to me." Not call, not come, but fail. A word of blame or perhaps of prophecy. Evelyn rose, crossed to the window and touched the glass. Her reflection blurred against the night. She said Clara's death had freed her from something, though not from herself. Graves had written to her afterward, desperate, terrified she would confess. She hadn't. She told him to destroy everything, the drafts, the letters, the proof. He hadn't, of course. He'd kept it because some men cannot resist admiring their own crimes. And now he was dead too, as if the past had finally come to collect its debt. Lewis knocked then, softly, to remind me of the hour. I stood, thanked her, though for what I couldn't say. She smiled in that quiet, tired way of hers and said that Oxford never punishes deceit. It simply archives it. I told her I would return tomorrow. She said there would be no need. When I stepped outside, the fog had thickened. I turned back once. Through the window, she was still standing by the record player, motionless. I heard no music, only the faint ticking of a clock. Later that night, Lewis called to say a neighbor had reported the sound of shattering glass. By the time they arrived, she was gone, a sleeping draught beside the empty wine glass, the Schubert spinning endlessly in the groove. I sat up long after the call ended, the photograph still pinned above my desk. Clara, Evelyn, the sundial. The words carved into the stone. Only time keeps faith. I poured the last of the whiskey and thought about that, about how truth so often ends not in revelation, but in silence. It was past midnight when I returned to the office. The city outside had folded into silence, save for the occasional sigh of tires through wet streets. My desk, as usual, looked like a failed experiment in order. The photographs, the transcripts, the crossword from Graves's desk, all of it lay waiting, patient as a congregation. I switched on the lamp, and the world shrank to the circle of its light. There is something peculiarly cruel about rereading a dead person's handwriting. Clara Dean's notes, recovered from the archive, were meticulous. Every word precise, every reference double-checked. But I had been over them before, and something still resisted understanding. I poured myself a small whiskey and began again. This time I forced myself to read slowly, line by line, as if deciphering a code. The moment came halfway through the third page. A quotation from Hardy, the same one she had copied onto the typewritten sheet found beside her body. But here, in the margin, a faint pencil mark, almost erased, altering the punctuation. She had written, "Woman much missed, how you fail to me," and then, in pencil, added a comma after the second fail. I stared at it, uncertain why it felt important, until it occurred to me. The addition shifted the rhythm. The line no longer described an absence, but an accusation. How you fail to me, a deliberate doubling, a personal echo. She had been addressing someone specific. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly. The word fail, repeated in her notes, her letters, the photograph's inscription, even the unspoken weight in Evelyn's last words. It was the thread connecting them all. Failures of truth, of courage, of memory. I poured another whiskey and watched the liquid tremble as I set the glass down. Lewis arrived early the next morning, looking as though he hadn't slept. He said the lab had confirmed what we already suspected. The fingerprints on Graves' glass weren't his. 2 sets, one belonging to Clara Dean, the other to Dr. Margaret Linton. The umbrella, too, bore traces of soil matching the riverbank. Linton had been there. I told him to find her. He hesitated, said she'd gone to London the day before. Some lecture or conference. I doubted that. People rarely flee toward enlightenment. Later that afternoon, I drove to St. Hilda's myself. The porter seemed nervous, as though expecting me. He said Dr. Linton was in her office. I found her seated at her desk, calm, composed, marking essays with the same detachment she might apply to her own confession. She greeted me as though nothing in the world had altered. We spoke quietly, 2 professionals rehearsing civility. I mentioned the fingerprints, the umbrella, the missing appendix from the archive. She neither denied nor confirmed. She only said that Oxford was built upon discretion, that some histories were safer unrecorded. Her voice, though steady, betrayed exhaustion. She confessed to removing the file, yes, but only to protect the institution, not herself. Clara had insisted on making the truth public. She'd tried to dissuade her, but it had gone wrong. A struggle near the river. A fall. An accident, she said. I noticed the faint smear of ink on her wrist, fresh, not from her pen. It looked almost like the shape of a fingerprint. When I asked about Evelyn March, she looked past me toward the window. Evelyn had known, she said. She had begged for silence. But silence, once broken, becomes a kind of contagion. I should have felt satisfaction, perhaps even pity. Instead, I felt only the dull ache of inevitability. The truth, when it finally emerges, is rarely the revelation one imagines. It is simply what remains when all the lies have grown tired. Back in my flat, I unfolded Clara's notebook one last time. The marginal correction stared up at me. A comma, no more than a breath in graphite. The smallest alteration, yet it changed everything. It struck me then how every crime I'd ever solved began with such a thing. A word misused, a gesture too brief, a silence extended 1 beat too long. Outside, the rain returned, whispering against the glass. I switched off the lamp. The circle of light dissolved, leaving only the faint after-image of the margin, and the sound of Oxford sleeping beneath its mistakes. It was a grey morning when I went back to St. Hilda's. The kind of colourless Oxford day when sound carries too clearly and every step feels like an intrusion. The bells had already begun for Hilary term, their notes slipping through the damp air like old confessions. I remember thinking, as I walked through the archway, that the sound was almost kind. Almost. Dr. Linton was waiting in the quad. She must have seen me cross the courtyard, though she made no move to leave. She looked smaller than before, diminished by something more than guilt, a weariness that no sleep could repair. The red scarf around her neck seemed too bright, as if mocking the dull tones of stone. She said my name, softly, and I thought she might run. Instead, she simply asked whether I had come to arrest her. I told her there was no need for that now. We stood in silence for a long moment. The college cat passed between us, indifferent to human tragedy. Somewhere behind the cloisters, a bicycle bell chimed. Sharp, fleeting, accidental. I watched her flinch at the sound, and something in the movement confirmed what I already knew. It had not been rage that killed Clara Dean. It had been fear. She spoke first, her words halting but clear. She had followed Clara that night, not to harm her, she insisted, but to plead with her. She had wanted to protect the college, its reputation, the fragile myth of integrity on which Oxford still balanced. Clara had refused to listen. There had been an argument by the river, a sudden movement, then silence. She said she had reached out to pull her back, but the ground was slick, the current fast. The red umbrella had slipped from her hand and floated away like a signal she could not rescind. When she finished, I asked her about the note found on Graves' desk. She knows. She looked at me, and I saw the faintest tremor in her mouth. It had been meant for her, she said. Graves had been terrified that she would expose him now that Clara was gone. He had called her that night, begged for another meeting. She had gone, though she hadn't meant to. He poured the sherry. They argued. He collapsed. Heart failure, perhaps, or something close enough. She left him there, dead among his moral philosophies. She hadn't touched the glass again. She said it as if confessing an etiquette, not a crime. The rain began then, light at first, then steadier. The bells continued, unaware or uncaring. She asked whether I would tell the truth. I said I would tell the facts. She smiled, a small, wry, devastating thing. The facts, she murmured, were the problem all along. When she turned to leave, I let her. There was nothing else to be done. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, out of breath, his collar wet. He asked what she had said. I told him enough, though not everything. He looked toward the gate where she had gone and muttered something about justice. I didn't answer. We walked through the cloister in silence. The echo of our steps seemed louder than the bells now. On one of the pillars, near the old sundial, I noticed a new wreath, lilies, white and already beginning to brown. Tucked among them, a folded page from a book of poems. Moments of vision. Hardy again. The same verse, only corrected. Woman much missed how you call to me. Call to me. The word restored at last. Lewis asked who might have left it. I said it didn't matter. Perhaps it had been Linton. Perhaps someone else who had understood the cost of small mistakes. The truth, like the sound of those bells, belonged to no one now. That evening, I returned to my flat and poured the last of the whiskey. The photograph still hung above the desk, the faces fading under the weak winter light. I thought of Evelyn March, of Clara Dean, of Linton. 3 women bound by silence, by loyalty, by the failure of a world that prized appearance over honesty. I opened the window a little. The air carried the faint chime of bells drifting from across the river. The same bells that had begun this case, and now, it seemed, were closing it. I listened until the sound faded into something else. The quiet that follows confession, or perhaps the quiet that precedes it. Before switching off the lamp, I looked once more at the crossword folded on the desk. The final clue I had never solved waited there. Regret expressed through absence, 5. I wrote the answer at last, without hesitation. Sorry. The bells were still ringing when I went to bed.